Oh, hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the book chat by EFC. Today, we're going to be covering chapter 2 of Don Miguel Ruiz's The Four Agreements. I go over this book every other day, read it for an hour or so, and I provide my insights, commentary of what I think about the book, and I talk about the relevance of it to executive function coaching. Now, if you find this interesting, please like and subscribe. Comment down below if you have any questions or if you found that my insights are cool or not. Or if they're not cool, then tell me why they're not cool down below in the comment section. Now, the second chapter is entitled The First Agreement, Be Impeccable with Your Words. And I think it builds off well from the first chapter where, we are ruled by a book of laws that is an agreement between those that we love when we were innocent, like our parents, our friends, our family members, etc. And this book of laws kind of feeds the judge within us to kind of victimize the victim within us. And the reason why this happens, this dynamic happens, is because at times the agreements that were formed as kids when we were innocent may not be the agreements that are realistic to us as adults. And when I think about this, the beginning part of this first chapter, or this chapter in general, about how to be impeccable with our words, I begin to feel a little bit anxious or have some fear associated with how I communicate to those around me. Because, to those like my nephew, to those like my employees, my clients, etc., I have some sort of influence around how they perceive the world and how they have agreements with themselves because of our work together and our relationship together. And I think about, if I live my life filled with fear of how I communicate to others, then my words and how I communicate my words will only just spread fear. So I do think that the idea of being impeccable with our words makes a lot of sense. However, I also get kind of caught up with the thought of how am I going to be impeccable with my words every single second of my life? And what does that even really mean? And I think what Ruiz does well is really helps define this thought process of what it truly means to be impeccable with our words, because I think this idea of being impeccable with our words is something that we were taught when we were young. And it kind of was taught so many times of like, always make your word count, or, stick to what you say, you are your word, etc. We're taught all these sayings over and over again, all mean the same thing, that the idea of it kind of has lost meaning. I think Ruiz does a good job with taking something so simple and logical that makes a lot of sense and backing it with real ideas that help solidify this agreement that we all should try our best to make in our own lives. That's my own opinion. You can have whatever opinion you want to have. So what is Ruiz's train of thought, right? So he first defines what impeccable means. So impeccable means without sin. And to the Toltec, which is, the society and the culture that this book is based off of, sin is defined as anything that we do that goes against ourselves. He talks about how angry words like gossip at the end of the day only makes us feel worse. So we shouldn't really spread the hate. And if we really think about it, the idea of impeccable has to do with not inflicting harm on ourselves. And the idea of gossip is kind of what Ruiz talks about as the main source of like harm our words can do, not only on ourselves, but on everybody else around us. And I think that concept itself is very powerful. If we really think about, how being impeccable with our words actually comes down to, does what we say out loud actually affect us? And how it affects us is going to influence how we communicate to society. I think that thought itself is so powerful. And I think it makes the idea of becoming impeccable with our words make so much more sense. Now, let me give you an example of myself personally. So in high school, my best friend had a girlfriend all throughout high school. And this girlfriend is actually his fiance now. And for some reason, our junior year or senior year or something like that, his girlfriend started talking a lot of gossip about me. And I think it primarily came from, we went out, we had parties, etc. And my best friend always talked about how fun it was. She wasn't a party girl. And what ended up happening was that his girlfriend felt like I was such a bad influence on him. And she began to really talk negatively about me. I heard it. I didn't feel good about it. So I started talking negatively about her. And what really happened for the next 10 years of my life with my best friend was that I was talking negatively about his girlfriend, now fiance, and his fiance or girlfriend, now fiance, talk negatively about me. And, it's so funny because we're over it now. When we talked about it and sorted out our feelings, we really just said, well, what were we angry about 10 years ago? What was so caught up in our emotions that we couldn't really recognize that who we were actually hurting was ourselves, but also the one person that was very important to both of us, which was my best friend. And I think that what happens with being impeccable with our words and the idea of gossiping and the negative emotional toxins that take place is that once those toxins take place, they stick. And you will defend your life to keep having those toxins in your life. And I think that, not a lot of us admit this, but sometimes I feel like I crave drama. If I don't have this particular drama whenever I meet with this best friend and all of our other friends, and we don't all kind of speak negatively about his fiance, it's like it wasn't a reunion or something. And I think that, what really happens is that once we all see his fiance, we get so riled up in anger and we get so emotionally charged. And for what? What was the real reason? We all can't really say. We were just so conditioned to believing that this person was bad for our friend. And I think that, Ruiz has some good quotes in his book. And I'm going to actually read those quotes for you guys right now. That helps kind of identify and explain the ideas of gossip that I think are important to recognize. So, using the analogy of the human mind as a computer, gossip can be compared to a computer virus. A computer virus is a piece of computer language written in the same language all the other codes are written in, but with a harmful intent. This code is inserted into the program of your computer when you least expect it, and most of the time without your awareness. After this code has been introduced, your computer doesn't work quite right, or it doesn't function at all, because the codes get so mixed up with so many conflicting messages that it stops producing good results. And I think one of the things that, this is just me rambling now, but one of the things that I thought was really interesting about the idea of gossip and being impeccable with your words is that when we're gossiping, we're actually trying to convince whoever we're gossiping to, whether or not they know the other person or not, that we are right, that we're in the right. And, in reality, there's so many perspectives. There's so many agreements that we make in life. And, it's not always about who's right, who's wrong. And when we are gossiping, we're actually spreading that virus of just negativity. And at the end of the day, that doesn't help us. It doesn't help whoever's listening to us. And it sure as heck doesn't help both of us when we see that other person that we just gossiped about. Now, there's another quote in here that I thought was really interesting. It's on page 40, and it starts at the bottom of page 40. It says, now imagine this pattern going on in a never-ending chain between all humans on Earth. The result is a world full of humans who can only read information through circuits that are clogged with poison, contagious virus. So I think that's really powerful when we are not impeccable with our words and we are not, diligent with what we say. And this doesn't have to be every day, every second of your life, but for the majority of the time, if we are not, then we are conditioning those around us to think and know that it is actually okay to just be negative with everything else. So much so that we can now only communicate in gossip. Remember how I talked about whenever I met up with my friends during the reunions, it would not feel right for us if we did not talk negatively about my best friend's girlfriend or fiance. And that's how it is, right? It's how that lack of being impeccable with your words, then it infects and influences the system in which we communicate. So that was very interesting. And I think the next part of Reese's chain of thought is, because I think that the idea of being impeccable and not having gossip, that all makes sense. But I think it's very hard to do that with those that you may not think highly of, or you may have a negative emotion around. But I think the next part, which I think is the middle of the chapter, Reese then talks about how, be impeccable with your words is actually starting with being impeccable with what you say to yourself. And I think this is so powerful because how we communicate to ourselves about our own self-image, and I'm not talking about just be super egotistic or cocky or like overly confident. What I'm just saying is giving yourself enough love and credit so that you know your own worth and that you know what you are not. So that if individuals are speaking negatively or trying to make you feel bad or etc., what ends up happening, what Reese ends up describing, is that if you have enough self-identity and enough love for yourself because you're impeccable with your words to yourself, then what ends up happening is that all those seeds of fear that are given by those that are trying to gossip and spread emotional poison, they cannot be planted. It just won't happen because your soil is not meant for fear, it's meant for love. If you give yourself love and you don't give yourself fear or doubt or anxiety or all those other emotions, and I'm not saying that you will never have those emotions if you have this agreement. I'm just saying that when we rid ourselves of that soil and we give ourselves the soil of love, which is what Reese talks about, the seeds of fear and anxiety and doubt, etc., are harder to take place. And I think that itself is also super, super powerful. And, when I think about, how does this relate to those that I work with? I think about all of my clients that struggle not only with executive functions, but also with anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts. I've always talked about how structure with them, or I always talk about how when we structure life with them and how to get through their day, feeling a little bit more accomplished, satisfied with themselves, being a little more productive. One of the things I don't actually really talk about is I don't actually talk to them about how to frame their own words to themselves. Whenever a student, gets an A on an exam or, finishes the class with a B or an A or whatever it is and feels a sense of happiness with what they've accomplished, whenever we talk, they always say, well, it was a fluke, or, well, it was because you helped me. I could have never done this if you didn't help me structure out my days, didn't help me structure out how I studied, or etc., X, Y, and Z. And they neglect to give themselves the credit. And I think that when it comes to executive function challenges and those that have it, it's all of the past agreements that they've had with the society and their surroundings that they've grown up with, and they are told and given these agreements that they are not capable or they don't have the right structure and they need help, they need this support, that support, this support. And at some point, the final agreement is that they are incapable of succeeding just by themselves. And I think that a lot of that agreement has to do with, sure, it could be, those around them not believing in them, etc. But I think a lot of that has to do with a coping mechanism for their anxiety of the failures that they've encountered. What is failure, or there is no association or less of an association with the fear of failure if they are protecting themselves by saying that, well, I will only fail if I do it by myself. I'm incapable of doing it by myself. So if I end up doing this by myself and I push everybody else away from me, it's normal for me to fail. And it becomes such a strong agreement, and it becomes words that they say to themselves. And it is like nasty fertilizer for that soil that I was talking about, that allows more fear and more doubt and more, depressive seeds to be planted and to be rooted and to sprout. So, I think, after reading this chapter and thinking about the relevance of executive function, I think that for myself as a coach, I have to really think about how I can help my clients journal more intensively to understand that when they succeed, it's not because of me, it's not because of their parents, it's because of themselves. They've decided to do the work. They've decided to put in the right structures. And ultimately, especially when they're being coached by me, every single structure that they've decided to implement was their choice. They have complete autonomy over their choices. And because of that, the results that come is all due to themselves. And it's hard for them to recognize that if they don't become impeccable with their words to themselves. So that was my insight, my ramble for this book chat. I hope you guys found it helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe, comment down below, follow us for more content. If you can, subscribe because it means the world to me and my team. Thank you guys so much. Talk to you guys next time.